Hello everyone, it's been a while. It's kind of difficult making this video. Israel has, for the past year and a half, been committing what is almost certainly the largest genocide of the 21st century so far in Gaza. They have killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, more than likely, as well as bombing basically all civilian infrastructure that exists. I have wanted to make a video about this topic for quite some time. The video I've wanted to make is on the historical parallels between previous colonial genocides and our current moment, showing how previous empires, the examples I'm going to use are the British and American empires in North America and the Germans in Namibia, have had this same cycle of engaging in decades and centuries of constant violence and colonization in regions. And then when that colonization inevitably creates backlash, creates anti-colonial resistance, using that anti-colonial outburst as a justification for finishing or continuing or intensifying the genocide they've already been committing, has unfortunately many parallels throughout history, and I think that understanding them can help us understand our current moment. As I said, one of the clearest cut parallels between Israel using the October 7th attacks as justification for ethnic cleansing I can think of is the history of the British and American empires in North America. As the British exported more and more colonists to North America, it inevitably led to conflict with the indigenous peoples. Shortly after the founding of the colony of Jamestown, the settlers, who were not farmers who knew how to live off the land, quickly began resorting to cannibalism to survive the coming winter. The local native population, the Powhatan, took pity upon the British and began to feed them corn. In time, the British would come to seize this corn by force, to which their leader Powhatan famously responded, "What will it avail you to take by force what you can quickly have by love, or destroy them that provide you food?" This is the time period of Pocahontas, who would be taken as a child bride by the British and later die in their captivity. In response to this land theft and rape, Pocahontas' brother would lead his allies in a massacre of the Virginia settlers. This would be the first in a long line of the British raping, murdering, and displacing natives, the natives eventually responding by massacring the British, and the British using that massacre as justification for continuing the genocide they were already doing. The British would end up winning this conflict and force the natives who had saved them from cannibalism into the very first reservations. The founding of another English colony at Plymouth Rock would end much the same. The settlers arrive, and only half would survive the first winter. A local Patuxet man by the name of Squanto would introduce them to corn and teach them where to fish. Over 20,000 English colonists arrived in the next 14 years, pushing the natives off their land, with many of them succumbing to smallpox. The British actually welcomed this news, celebrating the fact that about 95% of the native population in the Connecticut River would vanish. Afterwards, with the epidemic weakening the strongest of these Connecticut nations, the Pequot, the British would begin to apply more and more pressure. They would begin to ally with local native nations and begin liquidating large Pequot villages, selling the survivors into slavery and abolishing their sovereignty and outlawing their tribal name. After this genocide, other native nations would try not to arouse the anger of the English. Wamsuta of the Wampanoag people would continue his father's policy of selling native lands to them. They, however, became afraid that he might stop selling them their land eventually, so they brought him at gunpoint for questioning. He grew ill in the harsh conditions of British captivity, and so was allowed to leave provided his son stayed as hostages. He died mid-transit, and this would spark a war. Fearing counterstrikes, the British demanded that Wamsuta's younger brother, Metacom, surrender all of the Wampanoag's weapons. Metacom refused to yield as much as the rest of his family had done, saying, "I'm determined not to live until I have no country." A Christian native would warn the English that Metacom was preparing for war, and after he was found murdered, the Puritans put on trial and killed 3 natives without native input, which they took to be an attack on their sovereignty. In response to this execution, natives would ransack British homes, which resulted in the killing of a colonist father and his son. As the massacres became more and more mutual and grew larger and larger, the English would begin to massacre even neutral nations. Most famously with the Great Swamp Fight, a massacre of the Narragansett Nation. The Narragansett were neutral but had allowed other nations to seek refuge in their borders. The Puritans would massacre hundreds of men, women, and children in spite of their neutrality, even lynching an Englishman who had race mixed with a native woman. This would force the Narragansett to join Metacom's rebellion. As Metacom began to ally with more and more of the surrounding native nations, many of whom had historically been enemies but were forced into alliance by the threat of English conquest, the rebellion became bigger problem for the English. Metacom's war would become proportionally the deadliest war in American history, killing upwards of 10% of the entire English settler population. Eventually, Metacom would be killed and his wife and 9-year-old child would be sold into slavery. The remnants of these nations would flee into Vermont and New Hampshire and would ally with the French against the British moving forward. The French gaining more and more native allies would contribute to what Americans call the French and Indian War. I am simplifying a lot here, but the French had a much smaller population than did the English, with only about 60,000 Frenchmen compared to England's 2 million. Mixed with the fact that the French were generally much more interested in furs, not in taking land to farm on, meant that the French were a much smaller threat to most nations than the British. The French had much less incentive and ability to force them off their land, and the French also needed alliances with natives to bridge the 20-to-1 population disparity between them and the British. As the 7 Years' or French and Indian War would rage on, it would lead to a series of massacres, most famously the one at Fort William Henry, in which Algonquin natives would kill British prisoners of war after they had surrendered their weapons to the French general Montcalm. This is a very complex event, but it was done for a couple reasons. Firstly, because their military honor culture required war booty in the form of captured goods and people, and the French had kept them out of the surrender signing, ensuring that they got almost nothing. And second, as revenge against the British for past conflicts. Many of these nations had been previously victimized by the British. This massacre would be very famous, involving both soldiers and civilians, with the evidence of its brutality being literally etched into the recovered bones of the British, which often have cutting marks on the spines and genital areas. In the years to come, this massacre would dominate the zeitgeist of early Americans' understanding of and opposition to native nations. And while the actual massacre was brutal, it was a massacre, the English and later Americans would hyper-focus on it and exaggerate it. Shortly after this massacre, a large smallpox epidemic would devastate the native allies of the French. The British have typically claimed that this was the unfortunate result of the native massacre of the British. The British in the fort had suffered from a smallpox epidemic, and the natives digging up the corpses of British people and taking their smallpox-infested scalps and bringing them as home as war trophies led to them unfortunately spreading the smallpox to their families. On the other hand, Odawa historian Andrew Blackbird claimed that his people had been given a box by the British, who told them that the box contained something that would do them great good, and to only open it when they got back to their village. Once opened, this box was found to have contained dried skin, which when the natives came into contact with it, transferred to them smallpox. Modern historians like Keith R. Witter are sympathetic to the Odawa view, pointing out that the incubation period for smallpox is 12 days, and that there is no evidence that the natives got sick on the way back. This would be more likely if they carried something with smallpox inside of it and only became infected upon reaching their destination, as the Odawa said they did, than if they carried off scalps for the over 12-day journey like the British claimed. After the British finally defeated the French, they would consider their Algonquin native allies as a defeated people as well. The Algonquin viewed themselves as a still independent people who had simply lost an important ally. The French had generally maintained their forts on Algonquin land by annual payments of gift-giving. The English only did this to nations they considered equal, and so not do this with the Algonquin. The English viewed the natives as a conquered people who contained very few if any rights, and would begin to move settlers west into their lands. This would result in one of the greatest pan-Indian revolts ever, Pontiac's Revolution, which would see the allying of multiple native nations, mostly Anishinaabe nations, against the British presence in the Great Lakes region. Native allies of Pontiac would capture every British fort west of the Appalachians except Niagara, Detroit, and Fort Pitt, which they had besieged. At the capture of Michilimackinac, an important French-turned-British fort in the uppermost region in the southern peninsula of Michigan, a famous massacre would ensue, where the Ojibwe of the upper peninsula of Michigan would arrive at the fort pretending to want to show the British a game of lacrosse. As the British gathered outside to watch, on a signal one of the Ojibwe warriors hurled the ball over the wall and proceeded to enter to go get it. It would be at this moment that the Ojibwe women would undo the blankets over their bodies and they would begin to give their men the weapons they were hiding underneath. Almost every British soldier and some civilians were killed, with only the French and their Métis mixed-race children being spared. The French were historic allies of the Ojibwe, after all. They were about to finish off the last of the British captives when the La Brea Crochet band of Odawa Indians interfered to stop them. Now keep in mind this is the exact same band that had at least half of their civilian population killed by the British using smallpox as a weapon of war, and these are the ones who will interfere to save the British POWs and civilians. Perhaps the most important of the British to be spared was a captain named George Etherington. It was the La Brea Crochet's decision to not only spare him, but to allow him to temporarily use their land as a base of operations outside Michilimackinac that allowed the British to reassert colonial claims in the Great Lakes region. On another front of the war, smallpox blankets would be invented by the British Empire to help lift the siege of Fort Pitt. The decision came down to give the Delaware natives who surrounded the fort smallpox blankets in order to kill enough of their number to force them to break off the siege. This was overseen to some extent by Commander William Trent, who wished to see the desired result of the blankets, but was most ultimately overseen by a man named Jeffrey Amherst. Amherst was the supreme commander of British forces in North America and had famously low opinions of the Indians, stating that, "As to accommodation with the savages, I will have none, until they have felt our just revenge for the killing of so many innocent people." He went on to call them worthless tribes and stated that chastisement would be the surest means of binding them to the British in the future, and that they had collective blame for the uprising. Amherst also rejected the idea that the British held any responsibility whatsoever for the attack at Michilimackinac, stating that it would be madness to the highest degree ever to bestow favors on a race who have so treacherously, without any provocation on our side, attacked our posts and butchered our garrisons. This weaponization of smallpox would later become legendary, and is one of the main things that comes to mind when people think of the Native American genocide. As the British eventually became more likely to acquiesce to some native demands, as well as the complete brutality of germ warfare intensified, the British would eventually win Pontiac's rebellion and reassert control of the region. While in the short run this would be positive for the natives like the Albuquerque band of Ottawa Indians, bringing back the fur trade and bringing back peace to the region, in the long run it could be argued this was devastating for all nations involved, as the Americans would inherit this territory from the British and become even more brutal than they were. A point that people less sympathetic to a revolutionary view of things may have is that, had the natives been less brutal, perhaps they may have been dealt with less brutally. To respond to this, we can look at the example of Le Aubray-Crochet. In his history, The Ottawa Indians, Andrew Blackbird looks at an example when, after all was said and done, an Ottawa man was publicly executed at Mackinac Island. Him and his wife had been sleeping when a group of white men broke into their home and began dragging his wife out of their house and began stripping her naked with the intent to gang rape her. Unknown to the settlers, the husband had a knife and stabbed the rapist holding her in the heart, killing him. For the crime of killing a white man, he would be publicly burned to death. So even the L'Aubray-Crochet, who had consistently shown mercy to their enemies, who went out of their way to fight their own allies, the Ojibwe, to save white captives, even after having smallpox used as a weapon of war to kill a huge chunk of their population, they would face the same mass rape, pillaging, and genocide as the rest of the native nations. The Ojibwe, who resisted colonization with massacre, and the L'Aubray-Crochet Ottawa, who resisted that massacre, faced the exact same fate of mass poverty and language destruction. Unfortunately, I believe that history shows us that being given mercy, by the vantage point of empire, is almost always interpreted as having been given leverage. One last example from the genocide Native Americans I could use, although there are many more that I could use, will be the Great Sioux Uprising of 1862 and the massacres that followed. During the treaties of 1851, the Sioux would be pressured to give up the vast majority of their land to whites. Prior to colonization, their way of life required large amounts of land in order to survive. The buffalo they relied on required vast swaths of plains to live and eat on, meaning on the small amounts of land allowed to them now, they would not have enough access to buffalo to maintain their traditional ways of life. Mix this in with the mass intentional overhunting of buffalo by settlers in order to deprive the Plains Indians of their means of sustenance, and you have a recipe for mass hunger. In order to alleviate these fears from natives, as part of these treaties, natives were promised annuity payments in supplies and food promised by the US government in order to offset this potential famine. The problem is that in 1862, the United States was more focused on the Civil War in the South, and that the people at the Union Station in the West were generally less competent and more corrupt than those they sent to put down the Confederacy. Local bureaucrats and traders siphoned off most of the almost $500,000 meant to be paid to the Indians in exchange for the 24 million square acres of land that they had been forced to give up to local white settlers and the US government. Hunger and rumors stalked the reservation during the spring and early summer of 1862, and they fueled the Sioux's growing hatred not only of the whites but of some of their own people as well. By June, the situation was critical. Malnutrition was widespread, and many Indians looked hollow-eyed and gaunt. One tribe had been reduced to eating its own horses and dogs. Others had subsided for weeks on only roots and shriveled ears of corn, which in their desperation they ate raw. A few had already died of starvation. Little Crow, the chief who preached harmony with the whites, was forced to trade weapons for food and occasionally relied on his own white friends for a meal. When the starving and destitute Sioux begged one of the most influential traders in the region, Andrew J. Myrick, to allow them to receive food on credit, he allegedly responded by telling them to go eat grass. This condemnation to a slow death of starvation was too much for the Sioux, and they would start one of the largest uprisings in Native American history, the Great Sioux Revolt of 1862. This uprising would become famous for its brutality. The first place attacked was the Redwood Agency, where Andrew Myrick was later found with his head cut off and with fistfuls of grass stuffed down his throat. As the Sioux expanded their rebellion to more and more areas, they would kill more and more whites. Ultimately, over 400 white settlers would be killed, and thousands would be forced to flee. 1,700 Sioux would be forced into wooden stockades at Fort Snelling, and 300 Sioux would be sentenced to death before Abraham Lincoln commuted most of their sentences and left 38 to be hanged, the largest mass execution in American history. It would be in the wake of this uprising that some of the largest massacres of Native Americans would be committed by the American government. In 1863, the Bear River Massacre would leave 250 to 400 dead Shoshone. In 1864, the Sand Creek Massacre would leave 150 to 500 dead Cheyenne and Arapaho, mostly women and children. And in the 1870 Marias Massacre, over 200 people, again mostly women and children, would be killed. In the Sand Creek Massacre, the peacekeeping chief Black Kettle posed quite literally no threat whatsoever to the U.S. government. He obeyed all laws and orders he had received from them. He even raised the American and white flags of truce above his teepee in the designated territory the United States ordered him to go to. Nonetheless, his people, and later he himself, would be massacred ruthlessly, with his wife getting shot 9 times. No matter if nations rebelled violently like the Ojibwe or the Sioux, or appeased like the La Brea Crochet or Black Kettle did, the genocidal response was always the same. The first genocide of the 20th century is commonly accepted to be Germany's genocide of the Nama and Herero peoples of Namibia. Germany as a country is actually pretty young, only really coming into existence as a nation-state in the later part of the 1800s. Because of this, Germany's rivals in Europe, Portugal, Spain, France, and Britain, had a head start on them when it came to forming vast colonial empires. Compared to the holdings of France and Britain, Germany's colonies would be relatively few, and so they would have to develop quickly in order to match the productivity of their rivals. So when Germany happened upon the territory of Southwest Africa, modern Namibia, they would have to condense what Britain and France took centuries to develop into mere decades, and the genocide that would ensue would have many similarities, both with the modern Israeli state and with the later German Nazi Empire. The Germans would arrive in small numbers at first along the coast and then move deeper into the interior, committing constant crimes against the people who had lived there before them, replacing them with white German settlers who benefited from and participated in the persecution of the black population. Racial segregation would be enacted and Africans would find themselves the inferiors in their own continent. Settlers frequently got away with crimes committed against Africans. Women raped by German settlers were routinely whipped for trying to bring their rapists to justice. This, of course, could not continue forever without the Nama and Herero offering up some resistance to German rule, with this collective anger over the mass legalized rape, slavery, death, and racism coming to a pitch on the 12th of January 1904, when anti-colonial leader Samuel Maharero led his band of Herero soldiers into attacking the village of Okahanja, massacring about 150 of the German soldiers and settlers who lived there. This massacre, like many we had seen, would be exaggerated greatly by German media, who would tell and retell the story of ever-increasingly brutal and fake accounts of what had happened, claiming that black Africans were killing white German children and committed mass rape against German white women. This is in spite of the fact that the attacks against the Germans killed almost entirely men and rarely killed women or children, and that many of those German men killed were killed specifically because they had committed rape against Herero women and gotten away with it under the German colonial system. Adding on to this, there was evidence that German missionaries, who were actually spared according to Samuel's orders because they were sympathetic to their plight, were fired upon not by the Herero in the chaos, but by German soldiers themselves. As German technological superiority pushed the Herero back, the natives were forced into the desert. Once the natives were forced into this uninhabitable landscape, German forces were stationed onto the desert's edges to prevent the Herero from returning to the lands to eat, thus forcing their population into starvation. After months of this, the Germans would move on to forcing the Herero and Nama into what they called the Konzentrationslager, the German word based off the English term for concentration camp, coined to describe what the English had created during the Boer War. This English term was itself actually based off the Spanish term Reconcentrado camp to describe the camps that were used to suppress the Cuban rebellion under the Spanish general Valeriano Weyler. Weyler's camps themselves were actually based off the American general Tecumseh Sherman's Wars on the Plains Indians. Empires have a habit of basing their models and oppressive tools off of one another, which is why this history often appears so similar. Prisoners, being mostly women and children, were forced to work for the German state and for German businesses, with this work being so brutal that the majority of the prisoners would die. About 75% of the Herero and about 50% of the Nama would die in this war of annihilation, making it one of the most efficient genocides in human history. One of the most common points Zionists will try to make is to compare anti-Zionists to the Nazis. We heard this over and over again over the last year and a half. that October 7th is the worst day for Jews since the Holocaust. Appeals to the Holocaust are one of Zionists' biggest sources for their arguments. The truth is that if there is a road that leads to the Holocaust, it is the same kinds of settler colonial genocides that Israel itself commits. And there's perhaps no better illustration of this than the fact that one of the most influential genocides to the Holocaust was Germany's genocide of the Herero and Nama. Many core elements of Nazi race policy and government repression were based off of Germany's earlier colonization in Namibia. The first Freikorps unit was founded by a German general who had served in Namibia. The brown shirts of Hitler's street thugs were the uniforms of German soldiers during the Namibia occupation. Hitler's greatest crimes, the death camps, were built in the east, where his army sought to create new German colonies by conquering the Slavs and Jews who lived there and forcing the remaining population into camps, as German Southwest Africa had done. The earliest precedent the Nazi legal experts looked to when drafting the law for the protection of the German blood and German honor were the laws banning intermarriage passed in German Southwest Africa in 1906. In the supplementary decrees to the Nuremberg laws, the Nazis adopted the term for race mixing from the colonial laws of German Southwest Africa. During the Namibia genocide, the Germans would enact mass human experimentation against the Africans. The skulls of Africans were taken back to Germany to be studied by the Kaiserreich's leading race scientists. In fact, one of these men, Theodor Mollison, an important academic during this period, one of the most important race scientists in Germany, was the man that Joseph Mengele later received his doctorate under. If there is a side that can be said to be paving the way for a Holocaust, settler colonialism and its defenders have always been a much better leading culprit than opponents to ethnic nationalism ever could be. While most liberal discussions on the creation of Israel tend to center on the Holocaust in order to make the initial Israeli settlers appear more sympathetic and to portray the subsequent history of the region as nuanced, the truth is that the purpose of Israel was very straightforward even before the Holocaust. Israel was always designed to be a settler colony and an ethno-state that removed Arabs for the benefit of Jewish settlers. Theodor Herzl, the man who is often considered to be the father of Zionism and the man who the state of Israel itself calls the spiritual father of the Jewish state, famously wrote letters to Cecil Rhodes, the British colonizer and father of apartheid Rhodesia, about wanting to create a colonization that would benefit Jews. Many of the earliest organizations dedicated to Zionism were explicitly colonial. The Jewish Colonization Association was founded way back in the 1890s with the goal of creating a Jewish state in Argentina before it eventually settled down on Israel and changed its name to the Jewish Charitable Association. And the largest bank in Israel was founded in the late 1800s as the Jewish Colonial Trust. One of the most influential leaders in the creation of Israel, Zev Jabotinsky, stated that every native population of the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel. He also said in 1925 that, if you wish to colonize a land in which people are already living, you must find a garrison for the land, or find a benefactor who will provide a garrison on your behalf. Zionism is a colonizing venture, and, therefore, it stands or falls in the question of armed forces. This explicit need for early Israelis to have the military backing in order to be able to force themselves onto Palestinians dominates in a lot of early Zionist writing. Herzl himself wrote in 1896 that, should the powers declare themselves willing to admit to our sovereignty over a neutral piece of land, then the society will enter into negotiations for the possession of this land. There are two territories that come under consideration, Palestine and Argentina. In both countries, important experiments of colonization have already been made, though on the mistaken principle of a gradual infiltration of Jews. An infiltration is bound to end badly. It continues till the inevitable moment when the native population feels itself threatened and forces the government to stop a further influx of Jews. Immigration is consequently futile unless we have the sovereign right to continue such immigration. It is for this reason that early Zionists would seek to collaborate with the British Empire, which was the most powerful empire on earth during this time. Their collaboration would crystallize during World War I with the Balfour Declaration, where the British Empire formally declared their support for a Jewish state in Palestine. This declaration would benefit both sides. The British Empire on one hand would be given the chance to carve up the territory of their rival, the Ottoman Empire, and Zionists on the other would get the chance to use the mightiest empire on earth to force themselves on a population they themselves acknowledged did not wish to be ruled by them. Once the British occupied Palestine in 1917, they began banning all Palestinian papers and political activities. When the League of Nations issued its mandate for Palestine in 1922, the Jewish population of Palestine would be given representative institutions and the potential for self-rule, which would be denied to the Palestinians. Ironically, one of the British people most responsible for forming the relationship between the British Empire and early Zionists, Balfour himself, actually led the government that passed the 1905 Aliens Act in order to prevent Jewish immigrants from being able to flee the anti-Semitic lynching campaigns of Tsarist Russia to Britain. In the years before and during the early relationship between Zionists and the British Empire, the Jewish population in Palestine was relatively small. Between 1909 and 1914, about 40,000 Jewish settlers arrived and 18 new colonies had been created by buying land from absentee landlords. By 1914, there were 52 Jewish colonies in total, and Jewish paramilitaries were actively forcing Arabs from their land. By 1917, the year of the Balfour Declaration, Jewish population made up around 6% of Palestine, with the Arabs making up 94%. By 1926, this swelled up to 18%. With the ascent of the Nazis in 1933, the influx would become even larger, with 60,000 Jews settling into Palestine in 1935, more than the entire Jewish population of Palestine at the time of the Balfour Declaration. As the Arabs found themselves being replaced by a population with more international recognition and support than them, and having more and more of their lands taken, they would respond more and more violently. The British would suppress multiple riots during the 1920s, but the largest act of Palestinian resistance would be the 6-month-long general strike of 1936, which sparked a large 3-year revolution against the British and Zionist forces. The British Empire would eventually succeed in putting down the revolution, killing between 14 and 17% of the adult male Arab population of Palestine in the process. After World War II, the British Empire would be greatly weakened and begin the process of losing its territory. The British agreed to transfer control of what was then the British-mandated Palestine to the newly formed UN, which sought to partition the land between Jews and Palestinians. The planned partition greatly benefited Jews at the expense of Arabs, giving them control of the region's most fertile land, as well as placing over 400 Arab villages in the territory of the Jewish state. In spite of this economic benefit to the Jewish population, the demographics of this planned division would be hard to mesh with the Zionist idea of a Jewish-specific state. The first Prime Minister of Israel, basically their George Washington, David Ben-Gurion, was quite explicit in the Zionist need to change through force the ethnic demographics of Palestine, both before and during the Nakba, of which he would be arguably the most influential leader in overseeing and expanding. As a result of the UN partition plan benefiting the Jewish population at the expense of the Arab population, the Arabs would riot in response to its adoption, and it would be in response to this rioting in December of 1947 that Jewish settlers would enter and attack Arab villagers, beginning the ethnic cleansing of 75,000 villagers, which would eventually culminate in the Nakba. During the Al-Qisas raid, the Jewish fighting force of the Palmach would bomb Palestinian houses, killing 15, including 5 children. In response to this, as well as the assassination of the Shubaki family by the Zionist terrorist organization, the Lehi, Arab forces and militias would seek reprisals, opening fire on buses holding Jews, killing about half a dozen Jewish civilians. In response to this, Jewish militant organizations would begin rolling barrels of explosives and shrapnel down into the Arab part of the town of Haifa. As Arabs tried to put out the fires, they were gunned down by machine guns. In response to this, Arabs at the Haifa oil refinery would lynch many of their Jewish co-workers. In response to this, the Lehi would commit the Balad el-Shahik massacre, where some 60 Arabs would be killed. Before this massacre, orders were given to only target men, although not all those targeted were men. The next day, the consultancy decided that excluding women and children as viable targets would needlessly complicate Zionist ambitions. No longer theoretically limited to targeting merely men, from here on the massacres would get even more brutal. In February of 1948, several Arab cities were destroyed and ethnically cleansed precisely because the Zionists deemed them to be defenseless. When the village of Deir Yassin agreed to a non-aggression pact with the Haganah in Jerusalem, it would be attacked anyways as its population existed in territories the Zionists had already come to the conclusion would have to be depopulated. Over 100 villagers would be killed, including 30 infants. It was the publication of this war crime, along with their own different territorial ambitions, that would spur the 7 nations of the Arab League to go to war with Israel, beginning the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Now, Zionists will often try to overestimate the odds they were up against in order to either justify what Israel is about to do, or to claim some kind of military glory. The idea that Israel had fought 1-on-7 against all the Arab nations. It should be noted that the Arabs were always outmanned and outgunned. At the beginning of the war, Zionist forces had some 50,000 troops, and within a few months would have over 80,000. Arab forces, on the other hand, would never break 50,000, with those 50,000 being divided among many different armies. Not only this, but the Zionists were also much better armed. The Communist Party of Israel would successfully petition the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia to send them large amounts of ammunitions, while the Arabs received comparatively little backing from the British. And yes, the British were to some extent backing the Palestinians, and the Soviets the Israelis. History is very weird like that. The crisis of this war would be used by Israel as its golden opportunity to push the ethnic cleansing of Palestine as far as possible. I'll try to be brief in this section so as not to be too gratuitous, but in the ethnic cleansing of cities like Ramallah and Lydda, 426 men, women, and children would be killed, and 50,000 would be forced to flee. In just a 4-day span, from October 29th to November 1st, Israeli forces would commit at least 4 large massacres. In the Lebanese village of Hula, 80 villagers would be executed, while in the Palestinian village of Saliha, over 100 would be. The man most responsible for these executions, and who would personally carry out 35 of them himself, would go on to become Director General of the Jewish Agency. In the town of Safsaf, some 70 men would be blindfolded and shot, while their women and children would be raped and a pregnant woman would be bayoneted. Arguably one of the worst massacres of the entire Nakba would be the El Doaima massacre, where Israeli soldiers would flank the town of 6,000 people on 2 sides and, when the civilians could not evacuate fast enough, kill some 455 people, including 170 women and children. The soldiers who partook in the massacre themselves would recall infants with cracked open skulls, men stabbed to death, and women raped and set on fire in their own houses. In fact, rape was so omnipresent in Israel's ethnic cleansing of Palestine that even the leader of this ethnic cleansing himself, Ben-Gurion, would decide to hold back certain army units from entering cities because he feared how much looting and rape they would commit during the later 10-day war. And none of this is to even mention the literally thousands of Palestinians who would be sent to starve and languish in concentration camps according to Ben-Gurion's own diary, with some of them not being released until 1955. All of this would converge to result in the Palestinian loss of the vast majority of their land. By the end of the conflict, between 80 and 85% of the Palestinians would become refugees, losing all land and about 100 million British pounds at the time worth of property. Israel would control 78% of the former territory of Mandatory Palestine, and at least 720,000 Palestinians were successfully ethnically cleansed. This would be how the modern state of Israel was created, and how it would perpetuate its existence up until the present day. On October 7, 2023, Hamas soldiers and their allies broke out of their containment in Gaza and perpetuated the greatest attack on Israel in its entire history. Around 1,200 people would be reported killed, with over 800 of them, about 2/3, being civilians. Like historical events we have talked about so far, when the imperial power's constant incursions inevitably creates backlash, that imperial power will use that backlash as justification for escalating its already genocidal actions, and this unfortunately is no exception. Since October 7th, the vast majority of Gaza is in ruins, and tens, if not more than likely hundreds of thousands, are dead. Israel is bombing everything from schools to hospitals and shows no signs of slowing down. Instrumental in Israel's justification for all of this are stories, both real and exaggerated, of the brutality of October 7th. In the aftermath of this counteroffensive, stories would go wild in the West purporting to detail what Hamas had done. Stories of civilians being gunned down, tortured, raped, set on fire by hordes of Arabs spread like wildfire. Hundreds of civilians of the Nova Music Festival were gunned down after attending a music festival outside the Gaza concentration camp. The President of the United States, Joseph R. Biden, not only shared the later proven hoax of 40 beheaded Jewish infants at the hands of Hamas, but even went so far to claim that he had seen footage that quite literally did not exist of this event happening. Important to Israeli and Zionist propaganda around this event has been the idea that this attack came out of nowhere, that completely unprovoked, Palestinians attacked Israelis out of hatred for Jews specifically rather than any colonial policy in general. This is false. The towns that were attacked on October 7th that made up the Israeli border with Gaza were not founded organically or out of nowhere. They did not spring out of existence as a result of resources or trade like many other cities throughout history. Instead, they were founded and built with the direct intent of ethnically cleansing Palestinians. These towns are part of what is known as the Gaza Envelope, a series of settlements created within a few kilometers of Gaza in order to be filled with soldiers and settlers, with the goal being that their soldiers and settlers' presence would force Gazans to stay in Gaza and be physically prevented from leaving. After the ethnic cleansing of the Nakba and the forcing of such a large number of Palestinians into such a small area, many Palestinians would understandably seek to return to their former houses, villages, and farms. These infiltrators, as they would come to be known, would become a larger and larger problem for Israeli colonization. Many of these Palestinians were starving and desperate and seeking to return to the crops that they had planted. In Operation Harvest, the IDF was instructed to prevent starving infiltrators from returning to their fields and eating their own food. As the IDF became overwhelmed by the sheer number of infiltrators, the decision was made to move more Jewish settlers into this recently cleansed land to help contain the Palestinians. It should also be noted that while the Israeli military relied on soldiers and settlers for its colonization, the settlers also relied on the military for the same purpose. Together, the armed Israeli settlers and IDF would kill 1,500 Palestinian infiltrators attempting to escape Gaza. It was by working together that the alliance of Israeli soldiers and settlers would end the infiltrations, keep the cleansed Arabs in Gaza, and solidify the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The types of settlements that make up the Gaza envelope that were attacked on October 7th generally fall into 3 different time periods. The first were towns founded prior to the Nakba. These could be towns like Niram, which was founded in 1943 and was home to the Negev Brigades, a Zionist military force, or towns like Nerim and Be'eri, which were founded by Israel as parts of the 11 points of the Negev. This was part of a plan by pre-Nakba Zionists to colonize the southern part of Palestine in response to the Morrison-Grady Plan, which was an Anglo-American plan to divide Palestine between Jews and Arabs. In this plan, Arabs would get much of the southern Negev section, and so Zionists began moving settlers into this region to make it less Arab and to increase the chance that it ended up under Jewish control. When the ethnic cleansing of the Nakba came around, these settlements would be useful to Zionists. Niram, as we have covered, was home to the Negev Brigades, which would perpetuate many attacks on Palestinians. Nerim would be a base of soldiers during the August of 1949, where about 20 Israeli soldiers captured a 12-year-old Palestinian girl and used her as a sex slave for several days, before eventually shaving her head bald and torturing her to death. An act so disgusting and sexually charged you would swear it was invented by Israelis in order to describe a make-believe Arab crime. The next subset of Gaza envelope communities attacked on October 7th would be those founded during the ethnic cleansing of the Nakba, such as Sderot, Zakim, and Ofakim. These Israeli towns were usually built on top of depopulated Arab villages. Sderot was built on the Palestinian town of Najd, while the Arabs were forced to flee to Gaza. Zakim was built on Haribia, and Ofakim was built on Kirbat Futai. Then there are those places attacked on October 7th that were built after the Nakba, usually the Nahal settlements. These were settlements created by soldiers to help enclose the population of Palestine. Many of them, Holit, Sufa, Nativ, were created in Israel after the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty forced Israel to give up its immediate ambitions of ethnically cleansing the Arabs of the Sinai Peninsula. And yes, Israel even tried to ethnically cleanse the Arabs of Egypt at one point. The idea that the October 7th attacks came out of nowhere is on its face absurd. Almost every place attacked was founded by Israel with the express purpose of either ethnically cleansing Arabs or to solidify that ethnic cleansing once committed. And now that October 7th has happened, that ethnic cleansing has been put on steroids, with stories about what happened on October 7th being used as the primary justification. One of the primary justifications used for this genocide is Hamas's taking of 250 hostages. What is not brought up is the historical context of this. Israel has, and has pretty much always had, far more prisoners, read hostages, than Palestine has. Israel before October 7th had 5,200 Palestinian prisoners. Historically, the most successful way for Palestinians to get their captured people back from Israel has been hostage exchanges. In the 1985 Jabril Agreement, 1,150 Palestinian prisoners would be exchanged for just 3 Israeli ones. In the 2011 Gilad Shalit prisoner exchange, Israel gave up over 1,000 prisoners in exchange for just 1 soldier captured by Hamas. Unfortunately, when you make it almost impossible for Palestinians to get their people back via any other means but prisoner exchange, you inherently incentivize the Palestinians to take more and more hostages. Israel actually knows that this incentive exists, which is why they developed the Hannibal Directive in the first place. A directive in which the Israeli military will purposefully kill Israeli soldiers and civilians in order to prevent them from falling alive into Palestinian hands and giving them leverage. Israeli media itself actually concedes that this was actually used on October 7th and that some of those killed were actually killed by the Israeli state itself. Now, of all the stories to come out of October 7th, the one that has been most utilized by Israel and the one that is probably most difficult for me to talk about in detail has been stories of mass systematized rape used as a weapon by the forces of Hamas against Jewish women and girls. Polling in Israel shows that this is considered the most bothersome of all Hamas's actions, according to Israelis themselves. Now, I'll be honest, I've been thinking about how to talk about this part of the story for quite some time, so I figured I'll just be blunt and describe all of my thoughts at once. On one hand, if women and girls were raped, I don't want to deny or downplay that. Rape is obviously something that can never be justified regardless of context. Now, on the other hand, as we have seen both with native rebellions and especially the Namibia rebellion, colonial powers lying about savage men raping innocent women has been one of the easiest tools serving colonial genocide in history. For its part, the annual report of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights claims to have found digital evidence of physical and sexual violence, but has been unable to independently verify allegations of rape from journalists and Israeli police. And since October 7th, we have seen a lot of high-profile stories of sexual violence from that day later turn out to be either false or exaggerated, even by mainstream media. My takeaway is this. Sexual violence has been, objectively, by any metric, significantly more common and systematized by Israeli forces than Palestinian ones. Think back to how omnipresent rape was during the Nakba. There is a fundamental difference between brutality committed in a moment of hot zeal and brutality done constantly for decades. Currently, you have Israel stripping Palestinian men naked publicly and posting pictures stealing the underwear of Palestinian women to gloat over. According to the UN, Israel has systematized rape and threats of rape against Palestinians. We have examples of Israelis threatening to rape mothers in front of their children, and examples of Israelis raping prisoners until they needed medical assistance. Now, it should be noted that while polling does show Israelis being horrified by rape, that only really applies when it's done against them. Recently, Israel's had entire riots where the civilian population of Israel went up in arms in order to defend the right of their soldiers to rape Palestinians. Literally every crime the Israelis have accused the Palestinians of, they are far more guilty of themselves, and there's perhaps no better example of this than the brutality towards children. The number of children killed on October 7th was 40, or between 2 to 3% of those killed. Compare this to the percentage of those killed in Gaza by Israel who are children, which is 41.1%. So Hamas, in the deadliest, most brutal day of its entire existence, is dwarfed by the brutality of Israel, the nation-state, ally of almost all Western nations, on not just one of its deadliest days, but almost all days of its war taken together, which has killed an almost 50-50 split between children and adults. Not between civilians and combatants, between children and adults. I genuinely am not aware of a single example of an Israeli accusation that is not itself a confession. Originally, I had a very long section written here, but I found that I was just repeating what I had already wrote. Hopefully the conclusions should be obvious to my audience by now. The comparisons between what Israel is doing to what colonial empires have done throughout the past is difficult to miss. Now, I'm not going to lie, this video actually took a decent bit out of me. You can kind of hear it in my voice as this video went on. But I don't want to leave my audience feeling completely hopeless or powerless about the current situation. The anarchist Israeli YouTuber Revan Reeve, bet you never thought I'd shout something like that, actually has a pretty good video explaining materially why Palestinians still have a good chance of surviving this. Now, on my side of things, I want to leverage our collective ability to help Palestinians. I have created a campaign to raise money for food, shelter, and supplies for the people of Gaza. Now, I'm a pretty small channel, but I don't think $1,000 is out of the question. I'm going to give some of my own money towards this goal, and I hope as many of you as possible join me. It would be nice to know that I, and you, were able to contribute something to help the people in such a horrible situation, who really do need our help as much as possible. It would be nice to know that this video and all the difficulties that went into it was not in vain and that it was actually able to help people. Thank you very much.